Hello and welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to do some hands-on and create our first Azure function. We're going to start with HTTP triggered Azure function, and then subsequently we are going to create three more Azure functions which will be triggered by storage queue, then a blob file upload. We are going to use a JSON file that we are going to upload into a blob storage folder, which is going to trigger a Azure function. And then in the end, we will also see how we can trigger a function using Cosmos DB change feed trigger. Now to create our functions, we are going to use Azure Function Core Tools library that we installed earlier, and we are going to use the func command. Now here I have also attached a link to all the Azure function templates. If you click on the link, this should take you to a GitHub repo, and in this repo you can see there are a lot of templates available to create or these are just boilerplate templates to start working with different kind of Azure function triggers. So here you can see that we have Cosmos DB trigger available, then we have a blob trigger for JavaScript, we also have event grid, HTTP trigger that we are going to use. Now if you open any of these, you'll see that we have a function.json as we discussed earlier. Then they have a sample index.js file, some metadata available. So one way to create your function is to just copy over these files and make your own changes. But we are going to use these templates directly using the func command. So let's go back to our bash shell and start creating our HTTP triggered function. So under my work directory, I'm going to create a folder called Azure Functions, and I'm going to go inside this folder. Now, as we discussed earlier, to create any function, first you need to create an Azure app. And to create an app, you're going to run the command func init and just give the name of the app as, let's just call it my function app. Now, this is an interactive command, so I'm going to choose node or option 3, and then I'm going to choose 1 because we are going to use JavaScript for our coding. So we have a package.json file, host.json file, and a local settings.json created for us. Let's go inside my function app. I'm going to clear my screen and list them. Now let's open these in a Visual Studio IDE. So our function app setup is done. So inside host.json file, you can see that there is some logging related settings, the version, and the latest extension bundle is also added here. Now this extension bundle is provided by Microsoft, and these are just underlying libraries that help you connect to different Azure services once your application is deployed to Azure. I'm going to set it as false because I do not want application insights to be enabled. Now under local settings.json file, we have some environment variables already added. We also have Azure Web Job Storage. We will switch it to Azure storage account that we created earlier. We are going to put the connection string for that storage account so that our functions are able to connect to our live storage services. So let's go back to our Azure portal and pick the connection string to our storage services. DGG storage account. Scroll down, click on access keys, and you can pick either of the key 1 or 2, and we need the connection string. So I'm going to just copy it and paste it here. Now we are going to use this variable in our functions to connect to our storage services. Okay, so that was our function app. Now let's go ahead and create our first function. So back to my bash shell. Now to create a function under the app, you have to be inside the function app directory, and then you can run command like function new, give a name to the function. So this will be our HTTP trigger function, and we are going to use a template name for that. Now to create a HTTP trigger, we are going to use HTTP trigger template. And because this is a function, it will have some kind of authentication enabled. So I'm going to keep function level authentication. Other options are admin and anonymous. So if you do not want any authentication for your function, you can set auth level as anonymous. And if you want admin level authentication, you can set auth level as admin. We want function level authentication, so I'm going to set auth level as function. That's it, our function is ready. In our visual code, we can see that a new folder has been created with the name HTTP trigger function. I'm going to rename it to have proper camel case. Now under the function, we have function.json file and a sample index.js file. Now we know that for a function we need to have some bindings and trigger. So here we have a bindings array in the JSON, and we have one input binding where direction is in and one output binding, and our trigger type is HTTP trigger. Auth level is function. Now because this is HTTP trigger, we have methods defined as get or post. So this function can take both get or post calls, and we have also named our trigger as request. Now, so as this is a HTTP trigger, there must be some output or the return value that the function will send back to user. So we have a output binding with the name response or RES here, and the type is again HTTP. So this is how our bindings look like. We will see the usage of output binding and how to bind our output to this name response in our index.js file. So let's go to index.js file. Now here we have the context and request as parameters coming in. Now our binding will send the get and post data under request, and based on if this is a get call where we will receive some query parameters, or it is a post call where we will receive a body, we can pick up the input parameters and generate some response message. So this is just a sample response output, and to send back a response, we are going to map the output binding using context.response output. So res was the output binding name. To map your output to our output binding, we are going to set the value of context dot whatever the output binding name is to the output value, and this should be sent back to user as output of this HTTP call to our function. In the next lecture, we are going to test our function locally and then deploy it to Azure.